ever there was a bird that was designed by nature's imagination, it was the spoonbill. Spoonbill is quite a unique and it's also an iconic bird. Its uniqueness is down to its name really, spoonbill. That's what this bird is all about, the spoonbill. Spoonbills were once a really regular breeding bird here in the UK up until the 17th century when they were basically hunted into extinction from the UK. It wasn't until 2010 that spoonbills had returned to the UK and they first bred. In this video what we'll do is we'll look at how to identify the spoonbill. You think it's pretty straightforward, but can you tell the difference between a male and a female spoonbill? It's not as easy as you think. We'll look at their habitat and the locations where we can find them in the UK. We'll look at the behaviour, which is really what the spoonbill is all about. It has some quite unique behaviour and we'll look at that. I'll then go through my approach to photographing the spoonbills and I'll give you some top tips along the way. So how do we identify the spoonbill? Well, the Eurasian spoonbill, to give it its full name, is one of the easiest wading birds to identify once you know what you're looking for. However, telling males from females is not easy. The main feature of the spoonbill is its white body, and in bright sunlight they can appear quite dazzling, and that can be a problem when it comes to photographing them. Whilst in softer light they often display creamier tones, but mainly a pure white body, and they have long black legs. As the name suggests, spoonbill, the bill of the spoonbill is its most distinctive feature. It's a long black bill that widens and gets flatter and it ends up in a flat spoon-shaped tip, and that's where it gets its name from. And it has a yellow tip to the end of the bill. Crest, during spring and summer, adults develop a long crest of feathers at the back of the head. In addition, they develop a richer yellow patch on the bill and a yellow breast patch also. These features are reduced outside of the breeding season. When it comes to the male and female, spoonbills are not sexually dimorphic, meaning both sexes look very similar. In a nutshell, the basic differences between the male and the female spoonbills are that the males are slightly larger, bill is longer and broader on the male, and the crest during the breeding season is a lot fuller and a lot longer. The neck on the male is slightly thicker. So in summary, the male is more robust in appearance than the female, and it's only really when you see them together you'll be able to tell the difference. When it comes to juveniles, young spoonbills differ from adults by having black tips at the end of the primary feathers. They don't display a crest, there's less yellow colouring, and the bill is duller than the adult. When it comes to the spoonbill's call, the spoonbill is a surprisingly quiet bird. They rarely make vocal noises, relying mostly on visual signalling and bill movements to communicate between each other. Around breeding colonies or when startled, they produce a low, guttering, grunting or croaking sound. When it comes to the spoonbill's diet, spoonbills feed by sweeping their long, open bills side to side through shallow water and mud. They rely heavily on touch, not on sight when they're feeding, and that's why spoonbills will often feed at night, and that's why when you go out to photograph them you'll see spoonbills during the day just roosting because they've been feeding during the night. Their primary diet consists of things like small fish, crustaceans, aquatic insects, amphibians, and they'll also consume plant matter as well. Top tip, time of the year. So when's the best time of the year to try to photograph spoonbills? Well, the best time to see spoonbills in the UK is from late spring through to early autumn. Best months of the year, April to May, are when the adults will return and pairing up begins. Then between June and July, the breeding season is in full swing, and juveniles will start to appear towards the end of the breeding season. It's the end of July at the moment. In August and September is probably the best time of year to actually go out to find the spoonbill and photograph them. They're much easier to find in larger groups because it's at this time of the year, August, September, that the spoonbills will come together in large groups in certain specific areas. And that makes it the best time of the year for bird photographers to get the chance to photograph this unique, iconic bird. So, spoonbill's habitat. Where are we going to find the spoonbill? They're becoming more and more common during spring and summer here in the UK. Spoonbills prefer places like this. This is Slains Lane, which is situated in North Nottinghamshire in England. There have been spoonbills seen here lately, but they prefer things like coastal estuaries, coastal lagoons, freshwater marshes like here at Slains Lane, and reed beds. They tend to return to productive feeding areas around low tide. I'll talk about tide in a minute. Some good locations to see them in the UK are places like Leighton Moss, RSPB Far Rings. There are a number of other RSPB reserves. The one that's local to me, RSPB Blacktop Santon, at this moment in time there's quite a few spoonbills visiting it. Clay Marshes, RSPB Minsmere and Slimbridge are just a number of the places that you can see them in the UK. Top tip, tidal movements. I just briefly spoke about tides. Tides have a massive influence on how spoonbills go about their daily lives. So if you're hoping to photograph them, then it's important to understand why tidal movements and tidal timings is so important when it comes to photographing spoonbills. Tide times can be just as important what the weather's going to be. So there's two types of tides. There's low tide, and at low tide they tend to be at their busiest and their most active feeding out in the shallow lagoons. Best time is normally 2 hours before low tide until about 2 hours after low tide, when they tend to then move off. At high tide, spoonbills then tend to gather in communal roosts in shallow waters. Checking your tide timings before you go out to photograph spoonbills, in my opinion, is very important if you're on tidal waters. Places like here, Slains Lane, this is a freshwater marsh. When we look at the spoonbill's behaviour, I've always said as a wildlife photographer and bird photographer that one of the most important skills you have to have about your subject is understanding its behaviour. Being able to predict what a bird or a wildlife subject is going to do next gives you great advantages in being prepared for what's coming next. So we're going to look at some typical spoonbill behaviour. The first one we're going to look at is their feeding. This is their signature behaviour. Spoonbills tend to walk quite slowly to begin with through shallow waters, sweeping their bill side to side. And remember what I said earlier, spoonbills don't rely on sight, they rely purely on touch with their huge bills as they're sifting through the water to detect prey. So if you're watching a spoonbill and it's feeding and it's moving through the water and then all of a sudden it speeds up, that is because it's detected something which is quite large, normally small fish, something like that. So from a photography point of view, when you're watching spoonbills and they're feeding and all of a sudden they feed up, get ready, because once they catch their prey, the next thing they do is they're going to raise their head to actually consume it, and that gives you a great opportunity to photograph them. Another behavioural habit that spoonbill has, and I touched briefly on it again, is that after high tide, spoonbills normally come inland and they'll gather together in communal roosts. Now, prior to actually going into roost, they'll start preening, and again, that will give you good opportunities to photograph them and catch that behaviour of them cleaning their feathers, and also the iconic standing on one leg with the bill tucked into the feathers and their body. When spoonbills get disturbed or they become alert, they will often stretch their neck upright. They can freeze whilst they're actually assessing the danger, and they'll also give out some short, quiet grunts. Top tip, it's all about the bill. There are a number of birds that are uniquely equipped to survive in the wild due to the type of bill that they have, and that's what gives them their uniqueness. And there are some extraordinary bills out there. When photographing these birds, the emphasis has to be on this uniqueness. and how they use them. The Spoonbill is a great example of this, and your focus needs to be on how they use it. I did a previous video on how to photograph crossbills. Again, it's got a unique bill, and it's pointless taking a picture of a crossbill if you can't see its bill, and it's also pointless in taking a photograph of a spoonbill if you can't see its bill, and that's my point. It's all about the bill. When it comes to photographing spoonbills, the best opportunities for photographing them are when they're feeding in shallow waters in lagoons or estuary pools. Their striking white plumage, unusual bill, and their feeding behaviour offer great photographic opportunities. What I want to do now is just look at the equipment that I use. I shoot with two cameras, a Canon R5 and a Canon R6 Mark II, which are both full frame cameras, and I pair them with two lenses, an RF 100 to 500 and an RF 200 to 800 lens. I'll talk a little about lenses in a moment or two. In addition, you're going to need a tripod for taking long range shots, because often you'll get the spoonbills to begin with at range, especially when they're roosting. And I'd also recommend having a beanbag for using in hides, or if you're fortunate enough to get close enough to them in your car, from your car. What I'm going to do now is we're going to look at settings. I'm going to start off with camera settings, and these are my go-to camera settings for photographing spoonbills. First thing I'll do is I'll set it to AFC continuous or servo as it is in Canon. I'll set it to my highest frame rate, and I'll also set it to eye detection. When it comes to lens settings, spoonbills are notoriously shy birds and they're very skittish. So you have to be very careful when you're trying to approach them, because they'll often just take flight. In order not to disturb them, then your lens choice becomes very important. And I would recommend you should be shooting anything from about 400mm plus. So make sure on your lens that your settings are set as follows. Image stabilization is on. Your focus limiter is set to the minimum distance to infinity. For instance, on my lenses, I either have it on full or I have it from 3 meters to infinity. I'm not going to get within 3 meters of a spoonbill, so I set it from 3 meters to infinity. That just means that the focus locks on that little bit quicker. And also make sure you've got your autofocus settings set on also. What we'll do now is we'll look at exposure settings. And the first one we're going to look at is shutter speed. Spoonbills move faster than the clumsily strut suggests. Remember that I said that when they start to feed, they often start to feed quite slowly, but then all of a sudden, you'll see it in the footage that I'm showing, that when they start to get into a feeding frenzy, they're very fast. So therefore, your shutter speed needs to be able to deal with that. When we're looking at shutter speeds, we're looking at shutter speeds between 1/1000th of a second up to 1/3200th of a second. Obviously, the more light that you have, then the faster you can set your shutter speed, but then you need to keep checking your ISO also. Shutter settings that I would recommend would be as follows. For when they're going about, they're feeding, they're just strutting around, you're looking at 1/1000th of a second. When it comes to birds in flight, you're looking at shutter speeds between 1/2000th of a second and 1/3200th of a second. Spoonbill wing beats are quite fast, and when they're in flight, they actually fly with an extended neck, which is an identification feature when they're in flight. Portrait shots, when they're just standing still, if you're on a tripod or you're on a beanbag, then you could set your shutter speed to about 1/250th of a second. Aperture. Spoonbills are big birds, so I would recommend an aperture of between f5.6 to f8. My RF 200 to 800 has a fixed aperture of f9. I often shoot that at f10, which tends to be its sweet spot, especially when the light is good. On my RF 100 to 500, I set my aperture to f7.1. When it comes to ISO, I always shoot in auto ISO. As you can see today, we've got a bit of cloud cover with the sun coming through now and again, so the light is often changing. That's why I shoot in auto ISO. Try to keep your ISO as low as possible, whilst also maintaining the correct shutter speed. Obviously, the more light you have, then the higher your shutter speed can go. that should then tend to keep your ISO that bit lower. Exposure compensation. If you shoot in one of the automatic modes, and what I mean by that is aperture priority, shutter priority, or even manual auto ISO, then you need to consider exposure compensation, because your camera is going to make decisions for you that you don't have any control over, and that can often lead to either overexposure or underexposure of your images. So it's important to understand exposure compensation. Spoonbills, large white birds against a reflective surface on a bright day, you are going to have to be very careful. So you need to set things like your blinkies or your zebras, as they're known, which is your highlights alerts. You need to be able to read your histogram. So what you have to do is you have to expose for the highlights by setting your exposure compensation accordingly. And I would look at setting it from anything between minus 0.7 to minus 1.3 exposure valuation. It's better to underexpose an image and then in post-processing being able to recover the highlights. Another thing to consider, if you're confident enough to use it, is spot metering. I did a previous video on exposure compensation, which was part of a 3-part series that I did all about exposure. So the exposure triangle, exposure modes, and part 3 was about exposure compensation, and I'll leave a link for that in the description below. One of the final things I want to look at now is positioning. And what I mean by positioning is the position of yourself and your camera. So you've got the equipment, you've set in your camera settings, you've set in your lens settings, you've dialed in your exposure settings, and all you've got ready to do now is actually take your pictures. Now, getting into the right position is critical. No matter what your subject is, and the following are things that I think you need to consider and being able to do in order to get into a good position to photograph a spoonbill. First thing is to try and get low. Try to shoot at eye level and also try to focus on the eye. Remember what I said about eye detection? If you get low, got your eye detection on, you should be able to focus immediately. Backgrounds. Backgrounds are very important. Again, remember, the majority of the time you're going to see the spoonbill against a bright reflective background. So you need to be careful, even if it means moving a metre to the left or a metre to the right, to get into a position where you've got a good enough background for that bird to pop out. Okay, what I want to do now is just leave you with some of my favourite images that I've taken of the spoonbill, and I hope that you enjoy them. Okay, thanks for watching this edition of Kevin Hatley Photography and how to photograph the spoonbill. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have photographing this unique, iconic bird that we get here in the UK. All I would just ask is that if you've liked it, could you hit the like button? Could I also ask you to subscribe to my channel, Kevin Hatley Photography. It's completely free, it doesn't cost anything, and what that does, it allows me to grow the channel and be able to go out and share my experiences of photographing wildlife and birds here in the UK with people all around the world. So, until the next time, stay safe, take care, and I hope to see you soon. Bye for now.